Welcome back to another episode of Just Say It. I'm Chase. I'm here with Matt. Do you want to say something into this? We're sharing a mic today. We're good?
We get singing it together.
No, I think I'm good. We're glad to be joined by Joe Rigney. Joe Rigney is a professor and author of books such as The Things of Earth, Emotional Sabotage, most recently, The Sin of Empathy. So, Joe, why don't you introduce yourself a little bit more to the audience and tell us about the book, Sin of Empathy.
Yeah. Let's see. Currently, I'm a professor at New St. Andrews College in Idaho and a pastor at Christ Church. Before that, I was the president of Bethlehem College and Seminary in Minneapolis and was a professor there for about 12, 15 years, something like that. And before that, I was in college with you.
That's right.
That's right. We were both Aggies. Class of 05, class of 07.
09.
09?
09.
Oh, 09. Okay, so maybe we actually weren't there at the same time, which explains a lot, actually. So yeah, born and raised in Texas, and then Texas, Minneapolis, now Moscow. I write things. I teach things. It's great.
It's great, and we're thankful for it. We wanted to have Joe on the podcast today because his latest book, well, he's out here for a conference at Trinity Church. I don't know if the audio will be up after we release this episode, but he's out here for that. So while he was out here, we wanted to get him in the studio. But with the Sin of Empathy, I think most people hear that concept, and it's a fairly provocative concept. We know what you're talking about because our staff has read Emotional Sabotage. We've kind of promoted your work in our church. But for those who maybe haven't, you know, what are we talking about with the Sin of Empathy? Because most people today, they hear empathy, whether they've watched the Brene Brown video of like getting in the hole with somebody, they hear it as loving. And so you hear a lot of people talk about empathy as being like Christ-like. So when they hear Sin of Empathy, it's almost like, are you questioning Christianity?
That's right.
Joe? Are you deconstructing in front of us? What's going on?
Could be. No. So yeah, that's actually the Brene Brown video is a good place to jump off, because her video. So if you've not seen that, it's a clip from like a TED Talk she did years ago, and then somebody took it and did like animation with it, and it's a contrast between sympathy and empathy. And the idea is that like the video could have been called The Sin of Sympathy. Because the whole notion there is that sympathy, she says things like breeds disconnection and doesn't want to get its hands dirty and always tries to draw silver linings around your problems. You know, at least you have your health, and does all of this sort of like ham-fisted pseudo compassion. And she's commending a sort of more deeper engagement with somebody who's in a pit. You climb down there with them. You just sit with them. You don't. Her big thing is you stay out of judgment. Don't bring any judgment into there. Just this is hard, that kind of thing. And so the whole notion is that empathy is sort of like sympathy but better. Sympathy was this virtue, and it's almost like there was this like. Sympathy is this thing that's been around for a while, and it's like 1.0. But like now we figured out how to like level up in terms of our loving response, and empathy is compassion 2.0. And I think that's a kind of a widespread notion in society, is that sympathy or pity or something like that was okay. It's better than nothing, better than hating people or apathy. But like there's a better way, and it's this more total immersion. And so when this has kind of been going on for a while. That video is pretty old. I was reading this Jewish rabbi from the 90s named Edwin Friedman, who was talking about the fallacy of empathy. And the notion was that in all the leadership circles, the best way to lead is to become a more empathetic leader, in touch with your people, like connected, like feeling with what they feel and all of these kind of stuff. And his point was, actually, that's the way that institutions die. Institutions get hijacked, institutions get dysfunctional when empathy takes the lead role in an institution, a family, a church, a society, whatever. And instead, it becomes a power tool in the hands of the sensitive. So he had written that as this moment of like everybody's talking about how great empathy is, and I was seeing what Friedman was saying was right. Is that this was a way that emotions became like they would run the show. And nobody knew how to like sort of his book was called A Failure of Nerve. No one knew how to have nerve in the face of like churning, bundles of emotions. And empathy was sort of this encouragement to like just let it flow, like let all the emotions just flow in and out of everybody else, and it becomes a big blob of emotion. So when I'm talking about the sin of empathy, I'm talking about that thing. So if you hear empathy and you think that means just like being kind to people, or if you think if you think it just means, weeping with those who weep, and that sounds biblical because it is, I'm not talking about that. I'm talking about the same way that anger, we could sort of identify, anger could be a virtuous response. Jesus was righteously angry and turned the tables over. But we also know there's a sinful anger. And so we could talk about the sin of anger, and we mean that thing. It's the same sort of thing here, is that it's just we don't normally think, we think anger, good and bad. Fear, you could have a holy fear and an unholy fear, a fear of man. But empathy seems like, oh, that's not the sort of thing that can have good and bad versions. It's unadulterated good. And the point I'm making with the provocative title is, hey, think about that a little more. There actually are ways where empathy can go wrong. So that's kind of the basic. So if I'm not interested in wrangling about words, some people talk about pity, compassion, sympathy, empathy. It's that response to people who are in pain. That thing is a good thing. God encourages it. It needs to be anchored, tethered, and when it's not, it's highly destructive.
That's good. I mean, whenever I talk to somebody who's written a book, I have not written a book. I don't have no plans to anytime soon. But I always find it interesting to kind of dive into what's the motivation behind it. I think we can kind of get into how we see it playing on the world and ministry, all those kinds of things. But this podcast particularly is for our church and our people. And so is there anything where you kind of felt like, man, I should write on this because I'm seeing this just in like kind of practical, like your life. And so basically we're saying like, who hurt you, Joe?
Yeah, that's right.
And why did you write this
book? I was
book?
not hugged enough. Nobody's asked me that in all the years. No, there is actually a twofold dimension. So one was I'm reading this book by Friedman, finding it to be really insightful on dynamics that I see out there, but also like recognizing, like you said, there's elements of this that I feel like that I'm like, oh, I know that when someone is in distress, I want to make it go away. And there's a kind of like impulse, Friedman's book was Leadership in the Age of the Quick Fix. So there's this idea that like when people are hurting, we just want to make it go away. And so we start to act foolishly, impatiently to try to fix it quick because we don't have the pain tolerance. We don't have a high tolerance for other people's emotional distress. And I recognize that in myself, that there were certain situations, especially, I'm generally a pretty even-keeled, level-headed guy, but there were certain situations where I would feel kind of rising up this kind of discomfort with other people's emotions. And that would be, and then it would be like, I'm not thinking as clearly. I could feel that. So part of it was coming out of that, like a recognition, like I feel a pressure and I feel a pressure to go with it. So that's part of where it came from. Some of the applications actually were more like close to home. We can talk about some of that in a minute, maybe. But really, like in this period, I was teaching a leadership class at Bethlehem from about 2011 or so on, and I was using Friedman's book, and it was this exercise in trying to translate his categories, he's not a Christian, into more sort of biblical categories. Like this is your plunder the Egyptians, common grace, insights, how do we find this in the Bible? But then also watching in the world around and seeing like, this is happening, like the world is conspiring to prove the point. So from whether it's like, when Black Lives Matter got kicked off, like after Ferguson riots, and you begin to see like the way that in Christian communities was where I was, you would have these kind of like emotionally fraught, tense conversations, say about race, or later it became about abuse with the Me Too stuff. And you could just feel that like, we know this matters, and then maybe there's been real pain involved, maybe even real evil done, but like the charge in the room. And it was like, that is clouding everybody. We can't actually have an honest conversation about anything, because if you were to say, but what about this? You know that it would just erupt. And it would be it was highly fraught emotionally. And that was the sort of thing where like, you think in that moment, empathy is not your friend, because empathy is basically like hooking all of us up to an amplifier where your emotions get amplified into me and then get pumped into him in the back. And it's just like, and the more emotion, we know this, like we get blinded by anger, and we get paralyzed by fear, and we get overwhelmed by grief. And so emotions, passions are really powerful. And I was seeing how like, we're not thinking clearly because we can't, because emotions are just coursing through the system, and we're encouraging it because we all want to be empathetic.
Yeah, that makes sense. I think one thing that would be helpful for people in the church, and we read Emotional Sabotage, but it plays out in marriage a lot of times.
Yeah.
And, for listeners who may not know, like when you get married, you're fairly naive. You know, you don't really know what's going on. Like, I didn't know what the word complementary and egalitarian was when I got married. I love Kim, and she loved me. We want to get married. And then over time, you realize, oh, like, maybe I haven't been equipped the way I think. And so you talk about things in your marriage where you're trying to, like, live with your wife in an understanding way and love her, and she should show respect to you. And there's been books written on all that. But I do feel like this plays out even especially in the marriage relationship. So talk to me about how you navigated this with your wife in terms of, like, were you going to be like, hey, like, I've been committing the sin of empathy, or like, you are committing the sin, you know, like, like what's going on there? Like, how did y'all mature through this process?
Yeah. So funny thing about this is, you know, those like personality type tests, you know, you got the Myers-Briggs and different things. There's one called the Strengths Finders. One of my wife's top strengths is empathy. So then I decided to kind of become that guy. And it's funny. She thinks
you wrote a book about your wife's top strength and why it's a sin. That's where it is. Okay, cool. Just checking.
Yeah, we both think that's very funny. But the thing about it is, it actually is one of her greatest gifts. Is she's highly emotionally attuned to, like, what's happening in a room, what different people are feeling and thinking, which enables her to kind of meet needs in really, you know, helpful and wonderful ways. And she's helped me as someone who, like, I don't talk about a ton of this in the book, but in all of the research, there's sort of like two different ways of thinking about empathy. One is sort of more of a cognitive empathy. It's like taking someone else's perspective, but without necessarily sharing their emotions. And the other one is emotion sharing. And I would say my wife really excels in the emotion sharing side, and I have a high level of cognitive empathy. So when somebody's making an argument, I can kind of go, oh, I see how you got there. Like, oh, like I'm not emotionally invested, but I can sort of like follow the logic in a very particular way. So we're different in that way, but she's helped me to kind of become more attuned in social settings to different kinds of things. It's what, you know, this is what marriage does, is that you learn to help each other that way. But I will say that one of the things I discovered in my own tendencies, having been catechized into a mindset of be a servant leader, which means, you know, you're going to live with your wife in an understanding way, which is a biblical requirement. And you go, well, isn't that what empathy is? And it's like, it is, but like understanding where she's coming from isn't the same thing as affirming everything she thinks. And I think for a while, it kind of felt like I would be distressed if she was distressed, I was distressed. Her agitation or frustration with a situation would really like get into my skin, and I would want to like make it go away. And so I would feel that in marriage if we had a conflict early in marriage and we're trying to work through something, and it was like her being upset with me was a really hard thing to deal with because I had a very low threshold for her distress. And over time, it's been the sort of thing that this has helped me to kind of become more grounded and go like, it's okay if she's unhappy right now. The easy way out is actually to just like make peace to make it go away, which I think was the disposition. It was like, okay, she's unhappy, just say you're sorry to make it go away, which was effectively lying. Like I didn't actually believe. So there's a funny story that Nate Wilson tells. I think Doug tells it about Nate, but Nate was at a bachelor party and they're going around and they're giving advice to the groom. And I think the story goes that I think it was the father-in-law, father of the bride, who gave advice that was like, hey, sometimes in marriage, you know, you guys are going to get in a fight and you're not going to think you did anything wrong and she thinks you did something wrong. And at that moment, you should like value the relationship more than you being right. And you should apologize, even if you don't think you were wrong. It's like make peace, like value your wife more than being right. And then Nate gets to give the next advice, and he's like, hey, sometimes in marriage, you're going to be wrong. And if you are, you should repent of it and make peace quickly. But if you're not wrong, you should absolutely never apologize to your wife. And I remember the first time I heard that story and just feeling the like, oh, man, in my, you know, like, because you're just like that. You don't give that advice. But the whole point was it's a sin to lie to your wife. So don't say peace when there's no peace. The Bible talks about this. But when our emotions are running hot, we're tempted just make it go away. And I think for Christian men, good men who want to love their wives well and want to obey God, female distress really does, like, especially from like our wives, or if we have, I don't have a daughter, but like if you have daughters, like their distress activates something and our agitation kicks into gear. And it's in those moments where like what actually is needed is a kind of steadiness and an ability to absorb emotion, negative emotion, whether it's sadness or anger or whatever, and be able to go, okay, I want to understand this. I do want to, so live with my wife in an understanding way, not just dismiss this or shut it down. I want to see, where's this coming from? And then I want to take action that's actually going to help. And I think one of the ways that like the contrast I draw between like empathy and I try to use compassion, it's a more kind of longer history biblical word as sort of the good version. Empathy, I tend to think is, if people use it, it's fine. But one of the different, empathy tends to be oriented toward the feelings of the person, whereas compassion, I think, can be oriented toward their good. And those aren't always the same. And so like in a moment, I'm like, if you're in a conflict with your wife, you want to be thinking like, what's good for us? What's good for her? What's good for me? What's good for our family in the long run? Not just what's going to immediately relieve the feelings. And I think one of the things that's done is by having a kind of steadiness, it actually helps to anchor the family. Like there's a kind of like resilience because it's not just going to be tossed to and fro by her emotions, my emotions, the kids' emotions. It's not just a big soup of emotions that just leads everything. Instead, our emotions need to be brought to heel. They need to be obey God. Like, but what does God want us to do? And so I do think for husbands, it's like you should strive to live with your wife. The phrase is according to knowledge. Like, what does it look like from her vantage, which isn't your vantage, right? This is the kind of thing that like women are the weaker vessel. That's the whole point of that passage. If she's the weaker vessel, things look different when you're in the weaker vessel slot, and you need to budget for that. That's the idea, is budget for that perspective and take it as wisdom. Like, okay, I need to factor this in. I wouldn't have thought that way because I'm a guy, but that's a good perspective to take into account. And now, having had these two perspectives, mine and hers, now I can, as the head, lead wisely and faithfully, which means compassion in certain circumstances, or it might mean absolutely not. And so I think over time, I think my wife would say this too, in the same way that she's helped me to be more socially aware, emotionally in tuned in certain situations. I think I've provided a kind of grounding in certain things when, say, we've been in a couple of tangles in ministry where people are unhappy with us. And I know that for her, it's been a blessing when I'm able to kind of sort through the emotion and go like, yeah, but what did we do? Like, were we faithful? And people are just unhappy with that. It's like, that's okay. Like, but we did the right thing, right? And it's like in the grip of emotion, it's easy to lose sight of like the facts of the matter. And when you cut through it, it can kind of like, oh yeah, that's what we did. Like, that's all I said was this. And people are upset about it, yes, but that's what I said. And isn't that true? It is true. Okay, good. So now we should tether our emotions to the truth, not to other people's emotions. And I think that's been a real blessing to her to have a husband who really strives to do that, both with her and then with the world around.
So to piggyback off of that, so I'm picturing some guys in our church.
Yeah.
Right. And they're going, okay.
Yeah, he's talking about you, by the way. So if you were wondering, like, it's you.
Yeah. All the people behind me. All of them. There's hundreds. So a guy goes, okay, I'm gonna attach my emotions to truth.
Yeah.
Then he walks into work.
Yeah.
And they go, hey, we have a DEI expert in here today.
Yeah.
And they're gonna teach you all the things that are wrong with you. Mm-hmm. And because of these things, we need to show empathy to oppressed peoples and all the things that come with that, right? That's an interesting position to find yourself in. I'm a pastor. I get to avoid that a good amount, and so I want to be practical and helpful for people. I think it's great on the marriage front because it's kind of like, hey, we're married. Yeah. We're in this together.
There's a covenant and God's involved, and you want to obey God, I want to obey God, let's all obey God.
Yeah, there's like kind of an assumed foundation. But you walk into a secular workplace, and you're the Christian that's in there, and you're being told that you need to be empathetic to something.
Yes.
You called it sin.
Yeah.
And, so what are they supposed to do in that scenario?
Yeah.
Like, how have you had any conversations with people where they've been like, man, I'm trying to figure this out, but I also don't want to lose my job.
Right. And I think that's the question. So the first question is a practical one in terms of your obligations. You need to provide for your family. You also need to not lie. So there's a difference between having to sit through something that's false and being asked to like say the false thing, say the catechism back. Mm-hmm. If you're required to say the catechism, that's the offer a pinch of incense to the emperor, and you should say no. And that's a hard saying, and I know what I'm asking, but it's like Christians have had to do this for centuries, where the society around them demands some small act of obedience to the reigning gods, and if you don't, you're a bad citizen, and you'll lose your job or worse. And it's like, yeah, that's what Christians do. We God is God, not your little petty woke gods. So that's one thing, is if they're asking you to lie, you can't. I remember one time, this was when I was in Minneapolis, we had a gal in our church who worked actually for a bunch of other Christians, or professing Christians, but they were an advertising agency, and somebody asked them, that one of the clients they had was like the local pride parade, basically. And so she was put on this assignment to like make an ad, and she was like, I can't do that. I can't make, I can't make something ugly beautiful. Like that's contrary. And she's telling this to other Christians who were like, but you have to. And they ended up firing her over it, but she's like, I can't violate it's the baker at the wedding or the florist at the wedding, the gay wedding, that you have to say, no, I can't, and you take the consequences. Often though, all they're asking you is to sit through it, and like listen, and be able to pass the quiz at the end. Like, do you know how to answer the quiz? And I think there's ways to faithfully navigate that. I would say in general, you should, if you're a husband and you're the provider for your family, you should be trying to get yourself out of that situation as soon as possible. Like you're in your head, you should feel like there's a sword hanging over me, and I want to get out from under the sword. And instead, so that means if you need a side hustle, if you need to start talking to other guys in the church about, hey, does anybody have any openings? In order to work in an environment where you can live in the truth, you should be actively seeking to do that. But in the meantime, for you to be able to sit there and like hear what they're saying, understand it, see the play being run, and then be like resilient in the face of it, like don't adopt it, don't repeat it, and if you find other people, don't do it. Now, I actually think you asked me this question like 5 years ago, I think it's a much harder thing. I think now there's actually just culturally more space to flex a little bit. And so I would say it's probably the sort of situation where you could be the sophomore in the back asking, the really obvious questions that basically is like the emperor has no clothes. And so to do that, you should recognize you're probably in that moment speaking on behalf of about 5 or 6 other people in that room. Say it's a room of 15. There's 5 or 6 other people who are in your boat, and all they need is for you to say, "Hey, what about this?" And all of a sudden, they feel encouraged because you showed a little bit of courage. And if you can do it without losing your job, great. But again, like I think in this environment, there's actually probably a little more room. Maybe it's different in Boulder. I get that, but like culturally, there's a wider space for pushback against this sort of stuff because the vibe shift or whatever you want to call it in the wider society.
Yeah, just to kind of follow up on that, it's fascinating because when I talk to a lot of people about this sort of thing, what I actually find is what they're fearful of is actually not, losing your job or whatever that might be. Those are very real things that we've had people in our church lose their job over standing firm, and we're proud of them, and the church rallied and supported them. And so just encouragement for people watching is like, that's the beauty of being part of a church is, people have your back. But what I've actually found, what people are most scared of, and I don't know if you've seen this, is I think they have in their head, there's probably some things if they get called something or they get named something, right, that they're just terrified of that.
Exactly right.
Would you say that's
so
true?
that's absolutely true. And the thing is that looks like what's happening there is your empathy, identification with the DEI, presentation, is actually a mask for your fear of man. It's actually cowardice. So you think that I'm trying to be empathetic. What you're actually being is a coward. And making the adjustment. Well, I don't want to be like, if somebody called me a coward, I don't want to be called that. It's like, well, don't be it. Like you should care less about what people call you and care more about what you actually are. And I know, you should be able to kind of begin to figure out, you can imagine right now, what are the names people could call you in your job? Your coworkers could say, you're that thing that would make you really uncomfortable. And you should just know that's your steering wheel. You should think of that as a big steering wheel on your back, and you should try to remove it, because as soon as the world figures out what your steering wheel is, they will use it. And anytime you become potent, anytime the Spirit begins to move and you become a threat to the powers that be, that steering wheel is going to get grabbed, and they will try to mute you by the label. we'll call you, and then you fill in the blank. Is it, you're a bigot, you're a racist, you're a misogynist, you're MAGA, like whatever the thing is that they can figure out, and everybody's is different. Like that's what's funny about it, is it's not, this is a universal rule. In some contexts, I could imagine people, if they called you woke, that certain people would be like, that's the worst thing. Like certain kind of based context where like people would be like very concerned. I don't want to be thought of as woke. I don't want to be thought of as progressive or as a squish. And like that, I will do anything not to be called that. And it's like, that's the same. It's the exact same mechanism. The issue is it true? Right? If it's not true, you shouldn't care. Jesus said, actually, if they call you false things on his account, you should throw a party. You should have a big celebration because you just got promoted. Congratulations. Welcome. The prophets also were in this boat. So are you. Aren't you in good company? Have a party. And I think that that's a real hard thing for Christians, because we don't mind. Christians actually don't mind being hated, but we have a very narrow list of things for which we're willing to be hated. Because we know Jesus said, you'll be hated. But it's like, we want to be hated because I said Jesus rose from the dead. And so if they hate me because I said Jesus rose from the dead, then I'm okay with it. But if they say, I hate you because you think men are the head of their home and you're a bigot, or, like all of these other things, we don't want to be hated for those reasons. And it's like, yeah, they know that. They know that that's the steering wheel. So they're going to grab that steering wheel and not the one you wish they grabbed.
Yeah, it was really funny when, I think we could talk about this on the air, when the op-ed came out.
There's only one microphone.
In the Daily Camera. Yeah. And they called us pro-birther, misogynist, patriarchalist, compared us to Westboro Baptist. Yeah. And they called us, basically the Christian Taliban. That was really difficult for us.
Yeah.
Because it was like the first time publicly in a, it's a local newspaper. It's not that big or anything, but
right.
like that's.
But actually, local newspapers are harder. Like if it's some random podcaster that's going after you, it's like, who's going to see this? But when it's the local paper and people drive by your church and they're like, oh, that's the Taliban.
And you're saying we should have thrown a party.
yeah. And I'm saying like the mentality, and this is, try it back into marriage. I think that this is a place where like you see how it all dovetails. So say you're a member of the Well, and that gets dropped. I'm saying, yes, Jesus says in that moment, it's not true. Right. Well, some of it's true. Pro-birth. Yes.
Yes.
Yeah. You're wanting to go through and go check. No, not so much, but check. Right. And so they're getting some things, and so you're willing to you absorb it, and you might have a member who goes like, "Oh no, people at work are going to find out I'm a member of that church," and you might have a guy who hears us and goes like, "Okay, well, I'm going to man up and do what Jesus says," but like it's sometimes harder for a wife who's like, "But the ladies at the at the park know we go to this church, and they read that article, and they're going to think that I'm this," and it's like that's when.
Exactly.
That's when you need a husband who goes like, but honey, like the reason they say that is because we believe what the Bible says. Like what they're actually upset about. They're actually not mainly mad at us. They're mad at God. And right now they can't punch him in the face. So they're instead going to punch us in the face. Like we're the ones who are going to absorb that attack, because yelling at him doesn't get them anything, but yelling at us might get them something. And so you're trying to help like clarify. So like whenever guys are in this kind of scenario, it could be a pastor in a church, could be a guy at work, or in a marriage, the hardest thing is to keep your eye on the ball, because the emotions run hot, and it's like, but get back down to like the brass tacks of like, what is true? So they said we hate women. Do we? No? Great. Let's throw the party, right? Like they say that we want to like execute all the non-Christians like the Taliban does. Do we? No? Well, then let's rejoice, because they're saying false things about us. Like obey Jesus, not just in like teaching what the Bible says, but in the response that you get to what the Bible says, and don't shrink back from it. Because and then rationalize it by look how compassionate and winsome we're going to be. We have a mutual friend who works for like a big secular kind of corporation, and he for a long time had this like the winsome mindset of like, I'm going to go in, I'm going to burrow my way into this, and I'm going to be winsome, and that will give me opportunities to share the gospel. And it's like, and he says like it never worked. Like I don't know why it never worked, but it never worked. All of a sudden he becomes more outspoken in his corporation. And he becomes more outspoken publicly. And the opportunities for him to share the gospel have multiplied, because he's actually drawing a contrast with the world. And there are people who are uncomfortable with the insanity but they're not Christians, and so they just kind of go along to get along. And all it takes is a Christian saying, "But like that's crazy," for them to go like, "Wait, you think you guys you're the people who think that's crazy? So do I." And all of a sudden, now they're open to hearing the bigger picture because you were willing to have a little courage and not try to like avoid all of the landmines.
Yeah, that makes sense. I think that's really helpful because that plays out time and time again. One of the things I wanted to ask about, since we've got you here and you're kind of trapped in our dungeon studio at our church, is, this in ecclesiology and church culture, for a lot of people, it may seem foreign because a lot of churches talk about being authentic or inclusive or welcoming to all and all that kind of stuff. And so I think what a lot of people are looking for with a new church is, do they feel seen? Do they feel included?
Yeah.
And a lot of churches try to placate that felt need with providing either programs, or you could even we could talk about pastoral counseling. Matt and I are very adept at pastoral counseling, but it is interesting when you get in the counseling room with a couple, for example, and the tears start flowing and the couple's fighting, and you got to navigate that, how you don't get trapped in that. But I think under the broader theme of what is the church supposed to be in this kind of climate, and it can be really hard to resist that pull of empathy, because going back to what you just talked about, there's a temptation. Like I remember talking to a couple megachurch guys when we got name called in the local paper. They were like, you need to start a campaign called Love Boulder, and you need to signify that you're not those things. Prove it, right? Prove it. And so how would it change a church culture? The reason I bring it up, because you're up in Moscow, we've been there a couple times, and I think it's a very different climate than most churches, where most churches are like, you're going to have best friends for life here, you're going to feel really included. So tell me how it kind of shapes a church once you kind of embrace there's distinctions, and there's also dangers that you can fall into, and we're going to avoid those.
Yeah. So I think so take two different things there. One is the counseling piece. And I'm a fan of counseling. I think that there's people who have hard problems and need help. I do premarital counseling, postmarital counseling, and couples counseling, individuals, things like that as a pastor. One of the things though that we really try to focus on, this has been true for years, even when I was at Bethlehem, was action steps. It's not just let's come talk about things and sit in the emotion. Lewis has a quote somewhere the more that you can, it's in Screw Tape, where Screw Tape's trying to get, the more that you can get your patient to feel without doing anything, the more you've got him. Feeling things without actually doing things basically it becomes a dead end, and eventually he won't feel anything either, and you've got him for real. And instead it's okay, the feelings are awakened, but Jesus was moved with compassion. When his emotions came, it was wise action needs to come. So when it comes to counseling, a pastor should be thinking what's the thing that we're going to do next? What's going to change coming out of here? What's the exhortation and the counsel? Not just, did we all have a good cry? There's a place for that. There's a place for hey, get the emotions on the table, but they need to go somewhere now. And the place they need to go is to the cross, and they need to become obedient. And so what does God expect needs to be front and center. And a lot of counseling, I don't think that that's the case. I think that a lot of times it's treated as the emotions being expressed is sort of the end of the line. It's the thing that needs to happen. And then it's sort of, well, that was a make a little joke, but I'll save that one for off camera. But it's a sort of somehow or other, the emotions get expressed and then magic happens and all is better. But it's that's not actually how it works. There needs to actually be repentance. There needs to be, apply the gospel and then move. So that's one thing. The other is about as a broader church culture, are you Jesus's, our friend Josh Dawes talks about, you're not Jesus's PR guy. And I think that a lot of Christians feel the burden of this. And this is actually there's a chapter in the book talking, in the new one called Under the Progressive Gaze, where Gaze, just for the record, there's a pun there that's fun to make, but and we're in Boulder, so I don't know if that works, but
go for it.
Okay, yeah. But Under the Progressive Gaze, it was actually, this concept is drawn from the some of the woke stuff. I picked it up because certain authors were talking about black people feeling like they lived under the white gaze. Oh, yeah. And what it was is the way that they described it was black people who felt a kind of responsibility on behalf of their people to constantly be justifying themselves to a white audience. The ideal audience is this white person, and I'm always trying to prove that our culture is good enough and that our ways are good and all this kind of stuff. And I remember reading that and going evangelicals feel that about the world, meaning the left. Where you're all, and that's so your love, do the love bolder thing is like there's a little progressive on your shoulder trying to decide whether you're being loving enough. And so you better prove that you are. And a church that adopts that mindset is basically saying like, we're going to outsource our notions of what our mission is to this little guy on my shoulder, or pronouns he is ze her ze ha me, whatever it is, like that little figure which is often imaginary. What's funny is like we put a lot of weight on this little imaginary progressive, but it's literally imaginary because it's not an actual person that you're thinking about, or if it is, it's this kind of like weird, idealized version of them. And you're always trying to demonstrate that you are empathetic enough or compassionate enough, which means that you're going to then, the result for the church over the last 10 years has been the church basically takes up left-wing causes in order to prove that we are compassionate, in order that we really care and that you can trust us. We're loving, like Jesus said. But it's like, well, but did Jesus say to love according to a left-wing definition? Like, are they the ones who decide that? What if you decided that you were going to love people according to a right-wing definition? How would that go over, right? Like, it's like, and you go, well, we shouldn't do that either. I'm like, yeah, you're right. You should try to figure out what Jesus' definition of love is and conform there regardless of how the world responds. How did they respond when he showed them love? How'd the world respond? And it's like, it wasn't with like, oh, great. No, he came to his own and his own did not receive him. They killed him. And then the church that came right after him, they decided we're going after them too. And so again and again, there's this notion that the world, if we're faithful, the world will love us. And it's like Jesus literally says the opposite. You're going to meet with hostility. So I think accepting that and then realizing that you want to be compassionate, but not necessarily, that doesn't mean you have the reputation as being compassionate.
So it's funny because I remember, when I saw the title of your book come out, Sin of Empathy, and I was like, oh, well, that's fun. That's my disposition. That's Chase's. We're like, oh, well, this is going to be a blast.
Yeah, right.
And so I'm just curious as you talk about all these things like the world coming after you. I'm sure you've experienced some interesting pushback from the title. I also understand that book titles a lot of times they have an intended purpose to make you go, well, now
what's that about?
Yeah, what's that about?
Right.
But what's been kind of like the broader, like positive or negative, like what's been kind of what are people saying to you about that when you're like, this is my book that's coming out, and how people receive that? Yeah.
So, I mean, and I've been doing this for the last 7 years talking about this topic. And so for most people, this is like, oh, he's doing it again. But I would say I kind of get a couple reactions. First, people are like, oh, that's interesting. And then they listen. And they often some people recognize it and go, oh, yeah, I get it. And they're all good. There's other people who go, oh, yeah, I see what he's talking about. That's a problem. I don't like that language. I'll come back to them. Then there's people who just hate the whole thing, right? They don't like the substance and they don't like therefore they don't like the rhetoric. That middle group's the interesting one because I think I'm not insisting that everybody say it the way I do. And so it's a funny thing when people really agree with you on the substance, but then really want to fight with you about the provocative title that you gave to the book or the way that you talk about it. And I'm like, guys, you want to talk about enmeshment, which is what people say. What you're talking about is not empathy, true empathy. It's enmeshment. I'm like, cool. You want to use the psycho language? Use the psychological language. Like, that's fine. It's fusion. It's like everybody has different. It's emotional blackmail. It's whatever. And I'm like, all good entanglement. And I'm like, codependency. I'm like, all of those are psychological terms, which is interesting to me. I think part of the reason I get a strong reaction is because I'm taking a word that's very at home in a therapeutic culture, empathy, and I'm bringing a term that's very at home in a classical moral framework, sin, and I'm setting them next to each other. Right. And people don't quite know how to deal with that. So even, Allie Beth Stuckey wrote a book last fall called Toxic Empathy, which is a great little book, applying it to a bunch of cultural, political kind of things. And I think people actually are able to absorb that because the word toxic, it lives in that same kind of therapeutic world because it lives in the same world as toxic masculinity does. And so because of that, it doesn't jar people's frameworks. And part of the reason that I didn't intend this is like one of the, you do something and then like, well, I guess I'm going to stick with it now because it's working. The unintended thing was the moral term next to the therapeutic term actually does force a conversation that I would like to have. And I'm willing to absorb the blowback, but it is interesting how much that particular language does set people off. But I'm not hung up on it. If people have different ways they want to go, team, go. I care about the substance of these gnarly emotional dynamics that destroy families, communities, churches. I want that. And it's not about blaming. This is the other thing. This is one that came today, actually, is that someone saying, Rigney's project basically allows him to shift blame to, in this case, it was women, because women are more empathetic. And I'm like, the actual point of the book is not like the saboteurs you will always have with you, right? The woke you will always have with you. There are always going to be people who are going to try to manipulate your emotions. You're not going to fix that. I would like them to stop. And if you're doing it, and if you're one of the people who throws pity parties to get your way, stop it. But my goal is actually I'm not trying to mainly worry about them. I'm worried about their targets. It's the sin of empathy, not the sin of manipulation. Like, if I was, like, does that make sense? Like, I'm not going after the manipulators, even though I would like them to stop. I'm going after the people who are manipulated, saying, hey, you don't have to be steered this way. You can actually be a deeply compassionate person. Like someone who really does weep with those who weep, cares about others, and remains tethered to the truth, and therefore doesn't blaspheme God or dishonor and harm people in the name of, quote unquote, empathy or compassion. That's what I'm striving for. So take responsibility for your own emotions. It's not about the blame shifting. I think the other thing that just comes to mind on some of this is people then ask, okay, if you're saying sin of empathy, what do you do when you're faced with someone who's hurt? Like legitimately, like it's like real hardship, real pain. Like, I've in my pastoral ministry, in my family, my sister-in-law died of brain cancer in her 30s with 3 young children last year. My dad died of dementia a decade ago, and we've had other friends who have had, molestations and all the whole gamut of stuff that you can run into that's just horrific. So what do you do? What would tethered empathy or tethered compassion look like in those situations? And I typically try to kind of summarize it in like there's 4 things I'm telling myself in those moments. The number one, so first is like acknowledge, like this is hard. Like whatever it is, somebody says they've been abused and you don't know if it's true yet. Regardless, at that moment you can say this is hard. This is horrible. Because if they're telling the truth, it's horrible. If they're lying or exaggerating, still horrible. And so you can say that truthfully and say this is horrible. Someone's feeling deeply wounded, say by God, because somebody died and they're angry, and you're like, well, I don't want to validate the anger because it's not okay to be angry with God. Job's wife cursed God and died. You don't want to say you're right, honey. Like Job would have been unfaithful in that moment, but he could say, I know you feel that way. Like acknowledge, I see the emotions. Like I know they're there, and I just want you to know. It's like you're saying, like people do want to be seen. It's like that's okay. So this is hard. I know you feel that way. I'm with you. Like I'm with you down here. And then the fourth is I have hope. Like I'm not like you're being maybe swept away. The darkness feels pretty deep. That Brene Brown video, get down in the pit, but it's like, I see the sun still, and I'm not going to be down here pretending like there's no way out because I know Christ. And you may not be able to see him in this moment because it's so heavy and dark. You can't see it, but I do. And so I can like be with you in this. And it's okay. And I'm not afraid of your emotions because I still see Jesus. I'm not going to be swept away by them because I'm tethered. I'm anchored to something bigger than you. And so I think in a pastoral or even just like a, Christian to Christian, you're helping someone. Those 4 things. This is hard. I know you feel that way. I'm with you and I have hope. Like that for me is like, that's tethered compassion.
Okay, that's great. I got one more question.
Do it.
All right. So I was listening to the Sean Ryan show. And some of the guys in our church were listening to it, and he was interviewing Haley. What's his name? Travis Haley. And he talked about being a war fighter and how you have to have anger, not have to, but like there's an aggressive component to war fighting.
Right.
And I think you've mentioned this before in other places, but in that episode, Haley actually talks about the war fighter is actually deeply compassionate. That there's kind of a connection between anger and that compassion. And when he said that, it made me immediately think of stuff you've talked about, because you actually connect anger and empathy together. And I want more people to hear about that. So what is that about?
Yeah, good. So this is like, it can be, if both are tethered, your empathy, your compassion is tethered and your anger is tethered. That's all to the good. Again, there is a correlation because it's basically because I'm compassionate for what's behind me, I hate the threat that's in front of me. Like I assume that that's what he was getting at is like, here's an enemy, and it's my compassion and love for what I'm protecting that is fueling the anger, the aggression that I have toward the hostiles. And I think that's God's design. And it's in a pastoral context, it's you love the sheep, so you hate the wolves. Like you love the sheep, so you fight the wolves. How does that go wrong? Well, if you're in an untethered, unanchored environment, and empathy is designed, like it's like increase the compassion you feel, but it's often selective. This is, I think, one of the things that people fail to reckon with, is that as human beings, you're limited. You can only feel compassion for a certain, like concrete compassion for a certain number of people. Right? Universal benevolence is a great idea, but like in an actual context, it's like certain people are going to rise and your empathy gets focused on this group, which means to the degree that it gets intense, anybody who's harming them in your mind becomes your enemy. And now it fuels hatred. So Paul Bloom, about a decade ago, wrote a book called Against Empathy. So long before I was doing this, he's a non-Christian guy, The Case for Rational Compassion. And in it, he says, when people hear the word empathy, they think of kindness. When I hear it, I think of war. Because he's like, like the Middle East is what it is because of empathy. It's just that certain people have empathy for the Palestinians and certain people for the Israelis. And it's the empathy for those groups that then fuels the hatred. And so Bloom says that. You go back 50 years, C.S. Lewis is saying the same thing. He says pity, by a very natural process, leads through anger to cruelty. Because the other guy's atrocities, like, justifies your own. And so it's not a big jump to say pity for the oppressed classes, he says, leads to the brutality of a reign of terror. So like the Marxist sort of thing, like we're on behalf of the workers, we're going to like behead all the capitalists, right? And it's like those go hand in hand because the compassion for one is the correlate. It fits with the anger and the hatred for the oppressor, which is, and then once you get that, and then you just rewind the tape of the last 10 years with all the DEI intersectionality stuff, and it's like all of a sudden things fall into place. It's why the most empathetic people tended to also be the most angry at their political opponents. Whereas the folks who were like, hey, these are political disagreements, we're just trying to figure out the best way to govern society, tended to not have the same white hot emotion in play, and it wasn't for keeps. It's why the social scientists will say empathy fuels tribalism, because you have empathy for your tribe and therefore you hate the other tribe. And so like the more empathetic, if you're like more empathy, you're asking for more anger and for more hatred. And what I'm saying is deep emotion is great, but it's got to be tied to something else. Like there has to be truth, there has to be reality, there has to be Christ. You anchor it to that, let the emotions run, because now you've got a governor and a leash. If you don't have the governor or a leash, you're in trouble.
That's great. I mean, yeah, it's very helpful for people watching to be processing that and thinking through, what am I tethered to? Like, what's the governor here? How am I navigating these things? Because we hear it in our church all the time from people, right? Like, man, I don't want to be just swayed so hard either way and just hate my neighbor. I'm called to love my neighbor.
Right.
What does that mean? And so they're wrestling with all these things. But I really think a lot of times what they're struggling with is how to navigate this empathy that they're called to have.
Yeah.
And so they're trying to figure that out. So this has been really helpful. So, Joe, I would love for you, if you wouldn't mind, just to share a little bit. We would encourage people to pick up your book. Our staff read Emotional Sabotage as a group together, and it was super helpful for us. We've encouraged it to our church. We actually, I lead a monthly men's group.
Yeah.
We did one on emotional sabotage not that long ago, and so it was really good. So where can people find you, find more of your resources, all that kind of stuff?
Yeah, good. So if you're wanting, so you got the book. I've written, you search my name and the word, if you want to just find some of the free stuff, there's an interview I did with Doug Wilson probably now 6 or 7 years ago that kind of kicked off a lot of this. There's a number of articles at Desiring God. I wrote there for a long time, so there's lots of stuff there. And then now Canon Plus is kind of the place where you can find most stuff. There's more videos on sabotage. We just dropped a new one on Till We Have Faces. I teach literature at New St. Andrews, and so I did a little video with Christine Cohen on Till We Have Faces and the way, and it's actually a really, it fits really well with this, because that novel by C.S. Lewis, he thought it was his best novel, is about sort of the narrative that the main character tells herself about she's a victim, all the bad things that have happened, that actually is a mask for her own jealousies and hatreds, and hatred of the gods, and hatred of jealousy of her sister, and different things. And so that's all under there, but the narrative that she tells herself is I'm the victim. And so it's a really like apt novel for the modern moment. So if you want that, that's on Canon Plus, just dropped, I think, today.
Excellent.
Yeah.
Joe, thank you so much for coming on. This was really special for me because when I first saw Joe and Doug Wilson on Man Rampant 7 years ago, I was reading Brené Brown.
Yeah.
And I was very deeply confused. I was like, I understand the arguments she's making, and this guy seems really angry and mean towards other people. So I'm just delighted to have him in the studio today. And we'll try to put links in the show notes. I don't know if we do that, but he just mentioned where to follow him and where to buy his book. Go buy his book. Hope you enjoy, and reach out to us if you have any questions that we can answer for you, and we'll see you next time.